Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion will be part one of a series of about 6 sessions, somewhere around there, that will be focused on discussing and really explaining the software updates feature in Configuration Manager 2012. Today is the introduction and really the overview. So as we get started, with this, I want to set the stage, discuss what really has changed in Configuration Manager 2012 versus 2007, and really detail what those changes are at RTM, and then SP1, and then what's been announced for R2 as of this recording. So we'll walk through those. Spend a decent amount of time just going through a chart that has that. Then I want to get into the system and walk through the components of software updates, kind of walk through the section that is the software updates console. Future sessions will build on this, so we will actually spend time in the next session really leveraging this, showing how to use and create deployments and different things that you're going to see just briefly today. The session after that, the plan is to kind of dive deeply onto the server side, really understand how it works, and then we'll move to the client side, do a few sessions there, again showing the experience, if you will, of using the client side and the user experience, and then digging deeply into the client side and how it works, how to troubleshoot, that kind of thing. So that's where we're going. So we'll get to the lab here in just a minute. We'll spend a few minutes first just kind of talking through the changes. So a couple of slides on this, and then we'll be done and into the lab. So from Config Manager 2007 to 2012, there are a lot of changes, if you will. Some of them are cosmetic, some of them are more than cosmetic. But largely, software updates that you knew in Config Manager 2007, really a lot of the principles still apply in Config Manager 2012, but there's a lot of cool things that are new. And so let's just walk through them in no real particular order. So in Config Manager 2007, we had the idea of update lists, the concept of update lists, the concept of deployments. We still have the concept of deployments in 2012, but it was kind of a node to itself, if you will, in 2007. So in Config Manager 2012, we no longer have update lists. We also don't have a node for deployment specifically. Both of those items are handled now in something called a software update group. So software update groups, as you'll see in a minute, is basically a container that will hold a grouping of software updates that you want to deploy into the environment. Right? There's a couple of different ways you can make or you can create software update groups. One is just by selecting the updates from the list, right-clicking, choose to create the software update group. The other is by using a new feature called an automated deployment rule to build a software update group or add to a software update group whenever it's running, and you'll see that more in a minute. Another thing about Config Manager 2007 is there was a limit, not a hard-coded limit, but a practical limit of 500 updates in a single deployment package in Config Manager 2007. In 2012, we raised that number to 1,000 updates per deployment package, and that's really a lot of updates in a deployment package. So that is a limit, and it is a performance limit, again, a practical limit. But it's going to take a lot for you to get 1,000 updates into a deployment package by itself, right? And you can over time as updates are released and different things, but it'll take you a little bit probably to get there. Another item that really doesn't have an equivalent in Config Manager 2007 and is new in 2012 is the concept of automated deployment rules. All of these so far that we've talked about have been in RTM. You'll notice the asterisks on some and the double asterisks on some that you'll see in the next slide. The single asterisk represents those items that were added in SP1, and the double asterisk those items that are planned for R2, which is not released as of this recording. So we're at the first place that we see an SP1 addition, but let's talk about the automatic deployment rules first. So automatic deployment rules basically are the Config Manager equivalent of that same functionality in WSUS. So let me say it this way. In Config Manager 2007, one of the items that WSUS administrators were accustomed to when deploying updates is that they could configure rules that would go out and pull certain updates into WSUS and automatically deploy them so that there was not any administrative effort required to actually get that done. It just happened every month. right? We didn't have that in Config Manager 2007, but we do have that now, and it has a few more bells and whistles on it than I believe the WSUS one does, and we'll take a look at that, right? That's definitely new. One of the additions to Service Pack 1 was the ability to run an automated deployment rule up to 3 times per day to synchronize updates from Microsoft Updates. So that was specifically added for endpoint protection. The reason being endpoint protection definition updates come down from Microsoft 3 times a day, right? So this change allows us to synchronize the Config Manager environment with the endpoint protection schedule and make sure that we always have the latest malware protection and endpoint protection, right? In Config Manager 2007, we had a couple of different ways that we could search for updates in the environment. One was search folders, and there was a little node under update repository you could look at for search folders. The other was under update repository. We had a whole list of categories that would spread out for the various updates, kind of in a tree form, right? Both of those items are gone in Config Manager 2012. There is no search folder ability, and there is no category tree. Instead, what there is a pretty cool updated search filtering tool that I'll show you, and it does pretty effective job, and you can save the results for searches and so on to use them again later. So it's pretty cool replacement. Monitoring software updates is always a big one as well. So in Config Manager 2007, we had the ability to leverage state messages and look at reports and all of those kinds of things. And those are still available in Config Manager 2012, but we also have some additional things, such as the ability to fire alerts. If you have a deployment that hasn't reached the given SLA in a period of time, then we can send you alerts for those items. I'll show you where that is in a little bit. We also have redesigned the UI a bit, so we have a different way of looking at monitoring, which again I'll show you in just a little bit. In 2007, we had the driver update category, so you could deploy drivers through software updates. Now you cannot. That driver update category is gone. In 2007, we had the idea of immediate supersedence of updates. So what that meant was say that you deployed an update this month, right? And then next month, when you sync updates, a replacement update actually shows up for the one you downloaded this month. So what would happen in Config Manager 2007, and is the default in 2012, is that when you download the new update that replaces this month's update, you would actually supersede this month's update. So let's just put some names on it just for clarity. Say that we're in April, right? And in April, we download an update. Well, in May, we go to download some updates, and the one that we download in May supersedes the one that's in April. Well, what happens is the one in April no longer can be deployed. It's superseded, right? It's no longer scanned for. We're not going to treat it as an active update because we superseded it. Well, that was a problem for some environments, and customers might have to go through a change control process to get permission to deploy these updates. So when they did that, by the time they did that, they were ready to deploy the April update. It came around to May. The May update basically caused the April one not to be deployable, and now they had to go right back through the change control process. So now what we do is give the user control over how they handle the supersedence behavior. Again, we default to the same behavior as 2007, but give you a chance to modify that, and I'll show that to you in a minute. And then finally on this screen, the deployment templates node is gone in 2012. It was there in 2007. And the idea of deployment templates are basically still around, but they're only available through the automated deployment rules, right? You can think, really, at least I think, of automated deployment rules as kind of substituting for templates. They have a lot of the same settings. You save the automated deployment rules, so there's a lot of parallels there. Certainly there are templates that are available in the automated deployment rules as well, right? So and those templates really lay on top of the automated deployment rules and put certain settings in place. I'll show you that in a minute. And the other place that you'll see templates available for use is in the software deployments wizard, right? There are 2 deployment templates that are added by default in Config Manager 2012 SP1. The first is the definition updates deployment template. That is for specifically endpoint protection, right? And the kind of standard settings that we would recommend for endpoint protection. Then there's the Patch Tuesday deployment template, which would be the kind of standard settings that we would expect for a normal Patch Tuesday. So one more page of this, and we'll get into the environment. So other changes, and I've broken the first ones up we're talking about are server changes, then we'll move into client. So in terms of the software update point itself, at the initial release of ConfigMgr 2012, there really was no difference at all in the software update point, except for the supersedence kind of thing we just talked about. As of Service Pack 1, we've made some changes. So, for example, in 2007, we supported a single software update point per site. If you needed more because of scale, you had to deploy NLB, right? And then without NLB, you could actually deploy more than one software update point, but it would only allow one of them to be active at a given time. So we have the concept of an active software update point. Now in 2012, with Service Pack 1, we give you the ability to have multiple software update points per site, the only exception to that being secondaries. Because now we allow you to have multiple standalone software update points, we no longer support NLB on secondary sites. I'm sorry, we no longer support NLB in Service Pack 1 sites, right? So because we no longer support NLB, because we allow multiple SUPs per site, now the concept of an active SUP is deprecated. It doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore. Okay. So rolling on, in terms of synchronization of updates in 2007, we really had two options. The one that was most commonly used was to synchronize directly from Microsoft updates. The second option for disconnected environments is only to manually export your updates from a WSUS server and then manually import them into the configuration manager environment. Both of those are fine. Both work well. In 2012, though, we add a third option. So those two still exist, and now we add the option, though, to have a single standalone WSUS server or a WSUS server in the environment that is not ConfigMgr related, that might be your synchronization source. So consider the idea. Maybe you have multiple hierarchies in your company for some reason, right? And all of those hierarchies are today pulling from Microsoft updates for their synchronization. Well, it could be that you want to have a single standard for where the updates are downloaded in the environment. So you could actually set up a WSUS server and use it to synchronize the updates, right? And then point your ConfigMgr environments, all of them, to that single WSUS and go from there, right? So that's an option, right? Don't have to use it, but it's just another option out there. Next, we have a couple of items that have been added in R2. So there's no real equivalent in 2007. The first one is the ability through the automated deployment rules to modify the deployment package for an existing automated deployment rule. So what that means is this. When you created an automatic deployment rule previous to R2, that automatic deployment rule, one of the options in there is to specify a deployment package that you want to use, right? Once you made that association between the ADR and the deployment package, it was a locked kind of an association. So if you did have a situation where your deployment package started to get beyond or close to the 1,000 software update limit, you probably would want to change over your automated deployment rule and have it point to another deployment package. You couldn't do that without recreating the automatic deployment rule in 2012. Now in R2, you can make a dynamic switch, so you don't have to recreate the ADR, right? Then there's another piece coming called a software updates preview in ADR. So this basically gives you some insight into what some of the changes are going to be with the software update in the ADR before you pull the trigger and say go, right? So we'll wait and see what that looks like in an R2 environment, but those two are definitely coming. Now, moving to the client side. So on the clients in 2007, the interface that you are accustomed to using for running deployments is the Run Advertise Programs interface if you're manually running deployments. The problem is software updates are not surfaced in Run Advertise Programs. There's another interface that will pop up you can interact with and so on, but it's not in one place, right? I've run into several situations where software updates, having them show up in Run Advertise Programs so you can interact with them, would have been a really cool thing, but because they aren't, there were some challenges, right? Well, in 2012, we replaced Run Advertise Programs with a piece called Software Center. Software Center is a unified location for all deployments to show up all deployments to systems anyway, to show up. Users can go there, interact, and run deployments, whatever. So certainly software updates make a lot of sense to show up there, and in fact they do in 2012. So being able to go into that interface, manually initiate software updates either individually or now in groups as of Service Pack 1. So that's really cool. You can actually bulk select a number of updates and tell them to all go in Service Pack 1. Another thing that's cool about Software Center is this idea of using business hours, right? So business hours allows the user to have some control over their software update experience versus leaving it totally in the hands of the administrator. So what do I mean by that? So business hours, we'll see more when we get to the client side demonstrations a few sessions from now. But software business hours basically do this. So say that you're the administrator and you deploy some software updates that are going to be mandatory coming up in 3 or 4 days, right? Say 3 days. Well, the user is going to see that if you allow notifications and know that there's something coming. So maybe it's staged to go mandatory at 8 a.m. or whatever, noon, whatever the case may be. Well, you may want to allow the user to have a choice in that. And instead of waiting for that enforced time, maybe they see it and think, well, okay, I'm going to be done with my business day at 7 p.m. So they would set their business hours to be 7 p.m. And then they could then say, go ahead and deploy this software update outside of business hours. So what that would cue the system to do is see that at 7, go ahead and schedule those updates to deploy at 7 p.m. so that the user goes ahead and gets it out of the way. They're not disrupted when it goes mandatory a few days from then. Right? So again, it doesn't change the administrator having full ability to do whatever they need to do, but it does give the user some flexibility in their own experience. So that's good. And that applies to every kind of deployment, not just software updates. So in terms of updates themselves, in 2007 and in fact in 2012 prior to SP1, the only vehicle for obtaining updates for deployment was ConfigMgr itself. So in order for a client to deploy updates, the client would have to download those updates from the ConfigMgr infrastructure and then be able to deploy those updates when the time came. And that works, right? And works really well. But there are scenarios where clients might not be able to get to the ConfigMgr infrastructure, or there could be scenarios where you have trouble pushing content to a given distribution point the client happens to be talking to. So to kind of give you a fail-safe and allow those updates to be deployed and help your SLAs, we've given you an option that is available per deployment. I'll show it to you. That will tell the client, look, if you can't get it, we're still going to prefer to get it from the ConfigMgr infrastructure, but if you cannot get the update from the ConfigMgr infrastructure but know you need to run it, go to the internet and try to get it from Microsoft Updates. So again, the client's not going to do anything. It's only going to get those updates that are approved and sent by ConfigMgr, but at least it will give it another avenue to go to get those updates if necessary. All right. So the next couple don't have a ConfigMgr 2007 equivalent. Really, there's actually a setting in client settings that we now expose in Service Pack 1 called deadline randomization. So what that is, and it's disabled by default. It's actually, sorry, it's not operational by default. The wording's on it's a bit weird, and you'll see that in a minute. But by default, it's turned off. So what this thing allows you to do, if you turn it on, is when you set a deadline, say that you configure an update for a deadline of today at 2 p.m. Well, you would expect, under normal conditions, for all of the systems to deploy at 2 p.m., and that's correct, right? Because that's their deadline, unless they've deployed sooner. Well, if you turn on randomization, which is disabled by default, what that will do is give you a buffer of 4 hours. So it could be that the deadline happens anywhere between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., right? And that's really, one place that would be useful would be a virtualized environment. So if you have a number of virtual machines on a host and they all hit at once, it could be a little bit of a spike for that host to deal with. So that gives you some ability to randomize it. Software updates, if they don't deploy by the deadline, in many environments, they have to deploy right then. So there is no grace period. It's up to you how you do this. And again, by default, it's not going to give you some randomization, but you can turn that on if you want to. And I'll show that to you in a minute. The other thing in client settings, in the deployment, per deployment, you have the ability to interact better with Windows embedded clients. So Windows embedded clients have these things called write filters, which basically protect the environment of the client from being written to and persisting that write. So in order to deploy items to those clients, you need to disable the write filters. Well, in 2007, that was still the case, but you had to do it with an add-on, right, to automate it. Now it's built into 2012 SP1, where we just handle it for you automatically if you check the checkbox, and I'll show that to you, right? So it just makes it easier to manage embedded and keep them patched. And then the last thing, and we'll get into the demo environment, is maintenance windows. So we've had maintenance windows in 2007. We still have them in 2012. As of 2012 R2, we're going to add a software update specific maintenance window. So you can actually have two. You can have a regular maintenance window for everything besides software updates, and then a software update specific maintenance window that you can leverage. Right? So some environments I think will find that useful, others may not, and they may want to continue the way they're doing it today. But again, options are good, and we give you those options. So all of that time in the chart, let's move into the demo environment and start to talk about some things. So just a few items we'll talk about first before we start the walkthrough of the software updates node. First is the site system role software update point, which is basically the WSUS server. There's a couple of things I want to show you here. One is supersedence. So I told you there's the ability for you to choose how supersedence happens, and I want to show that to you. The other items just to point out with the software update point, we already mentioned it to mention it again. In Service Pack 1, you can have multiple software update points. RTM, you could not, right? Once you have SP1, then we lose the concept of an active software update point because you can have multiples, and we also lose the ability to have NLB. You don't need it when you can have multiple software update points. And then also for synchronization of the software update point, you can synchronize to an upstream WSUS server instead of Microsoft Updates. Again, those last four, all part of SP1, not RTM. And then also in the console that I want to show you is this client components, the settings basically, where we can expose deadline randomization, some of the software updates, client settings as well. And then we can also have some impact through client settings for notifications, how those happen in the environment. Then we have some global settings that impact notifications, and then we have the deployment specific settings that impact notification. And I want to show those to you. So we'll spend the rest of the time in the console talking about the software update components, and then I also want to do a software updates walkthrough, and then we'll end it up. So let's go ahead and pull in the demo environment, and we will do that. All right. So here I have my site server, right? And so we'll start just at sites. I have a CAS here. If you don't have a CAS, you look at the primary site, wherever your top level is in the hierarchy. And I want to look at the software update point to see how it's configured. So most of this will be very familiar. There are some changes. So under sync settings, you see the first one. So I mentioned the ability to synchronize from an upstream WSUS server in the environment, not Microsoft Updates. That is surfaced here. That was not there prior to SP1 in 2012, and certainly not in 2007. In terms of the rest of it's pretty standard. The other changes, so in classifications, again, we had drivers in 2007. We no longer do in 2012. Products don't really matter. There's a bunch of them. The sync schedule, everything's pretty much the same here, except for alerts. So notice you can alert in the ConfigMgr environment if synchronization fails. Synchronization is a very important thing for software updates, and a mission critical thing for software updates in most environments, making sure you have the latest update synchronized. So you could decide to alert if there's a problem. And if there's a problem, maybe you want to get a pager alert or an email alert or whatever. Sorry, I meant to say email, not pager. You want to get an email alert. You can absolutely subscribe, if you will, to these alerts and get an email on selected alerts that are important to you in SP1. In RTM, you could still get alerts mailed to you, but they were specifically endpoint alerts. Now it's any alert, right? You can choose to subscribe to. So that's there. Other things, supersedence rules. So this is where you impact how you want things to work. So again, we default to the normal standard behavior in 2007 to immediately expire any update that's been superseded. If you don't want that, then we're still going to bring down the superseding update, but you don't have to have it expired immediately. You can wait a period of time, and you can choose whatever you want for your environment. Then finally, there's the languages tab. Again, pretty much standard stuff here. So in addition to the software update point, we have client settings. So I'll just use default client settings. And we have the software update settings right here. And these should be very familiar. These are very similar, in fact, the same as what you had in ConfigMgr 2007. One would think all of the software update settings are going to be under the software updates node. They're really not. If we go to computer agent, you'll see another couple of items. First is this disabled deadline randomization, and it's set to yes, true. So by default, we're not going to randomize the deadline, right? If you want to do that, you set this to no. To me, the wording on that is a little bit confusing, but still, it's disabled by default. Also, in client settings are places where you can put in your organization name and so on. But here are the settings that you can impact the frequency of the notifications as we approach the deadline. Right? So these are the global settings, or I say global. These are the ones that impact the clients collectively. Right? In 2012, you can have different client settings for different collections of clients, if you will. And so while these settings are deployed from here, that kind of globally, they can be different for the different sets of clients. Other settings in terms of whether to get notified and how that works is a per deployment type of thing that we'll see in just a minute. In fact, now. So those are the two precursor areas. If we want to deal with software updates, then we're going to go to that node under software library, and this is what we find, right? So we start with the software updates node, and we look pretty simple here, just 4 subnodes. The first one is all software updates. So as the name implies, whenever we click on that, we're going to read out all of the software updates in the environment up to, by default, 1,000, right? So we're going to stop listing at 1,000, and because that's our default setting, but we get presented a bar here that says, okay, here's our default setting, but if you want to allow it to bring in more, then go ahead and click here. We're going to up that default to 100,000. So I can click on that. It'll reverse itself and start going and bringing in other updates, and you'll see it click through pretty quickly past the 1,000 and start to grow here. So there, we're starting to go past 1,000 now. So it'll populate here as we go. So other things that you can do from here. So certainly you can manually synchronize software updates. I'll just mention here and talk about it more later. There is a difference between a manually initiated sync and a scheduled sync, right? We'll see that more as we talk about it in I think next session. Here is where you can schedule some summarization of results and different things as they come in, right? Here's little ribbon options to download or create software update groups and different things, deploy, move, whatever, properties of updates. So all of those are available in right-click options as well. So let's talk about a few of these items, right? So the first thing is, if you're probably not going to want to sit and deal with an entire list of 5,421 or more updates, right? So you're probably going to want to hone in just on those that you care about. So that's where the search options come in. So I can easily come over here and add criteria. I can add a number of criteria. I'll just use products. There we go, product, and add that, right? Or I could come in and add even more criteria and say that I want not required and add that, right, or whatever, and just keep going if I want to. I don't need that one, so I'll quit. So I'll just show all of the updates that are for the Bing bar, right, and go ahead and search, and that should bring it down to a much smaller list. Yeah, just 6 of them, right? So as you work, you're going to have common queries that will pull back data that you want to work with, right? So it's really nice to have that drop down that you can select these things. It's even nicer to be able to save your search. So I'll just call this test search 1. I believe I have a test search in there already, and hit OK. So now if I need to revisit a search, I have it available. I have it in a list of recent searches, right? Right there is my recent search. I have search settings that I can specify. Here's where by default we limit to 1,000. I can specify that to whatever I want as the default for my environment. And I have my saved searches, so I can manage searches for the current node, which brings up all of my software update searches, or I can manage global searches, which I don't for all objects, which I don't have right now. So search is something I'm showing for software updates. It is definitely something that exists across all of the console, right? Pretty ubiquitous search. Okay, so now that I have, I'll just go back into my recent searches and do Bing bar and pull that back. So now that I have these updates up here, I can go and look at properties for the update, look all in here, find out the details, look at the maximum runtime. So that's 60 minutes by default. Other ones will be 10 minutes, I believe, is the other standard. Let's see. Yeah, it depends on which update you're looking at. So one thing about the maximum runtime, you do want to be aware of the updates and what they require, because with the maximum runtime of 60 minutes, which this thing probably doesn't take near that long, when you have maintenance windows in the picture, it's going to impact the number of updates you can do, right? So if I go in here and look at just all of my updates without the filter, then I can here get rid of it. Let's see. Oh, let's see. There. Get rid of it. Don't know why it took me a minute to see that. And we'll see the full list again. So if I can go into just a cumulative security update here, look at the maximum runtime, it's 10 minutes, right? So it is different per update. Just be aware of it and the impact it could have on maintenance windows. You can set custom severity here, content information. Again, this should be very familiar. Bundle information, different things, right? Supersedence information, whatever. Okay. The other thing, let me show you this. If you actually have deployed an update, let me go back to one that I know that I've deployed. So let me go into a save search where I have a sample save search. I believe that's what I want. Yeah. This one, I believe I have deployed already. So notice this NAP evaluation shows up whenever you have a deployed update, right? But if you haven't deployed the update, it doesn't. So these up here, I don't believe I have, or these down here, I don't think I have deployed. We'll look again. The NAP evaluation isn't there. So again, that's another difference. The NAP evaluation piece is kind of relocated on per update basis or whatever that you've deployed. All right, some other things here. So I can choose to simply highlight a bunch of updates, pick one update, whatever, right-click on it, choose to download that update into my deployment package now. I can create a software update group based on these updates. I can even edit membership of the updates. This is actually kind of cool. So when you think about maintenance of your software updates, which you'll definitely want to do, right? Moving software updates between software update groups is something you'll do routinely, right? Unless you have something like Orchestrator or PowerShell scripts or something to do it for you, which we'll touch on that in other sessions. You'll want to be able to move things quickly. So if you edit the membership, you can just simply put check marks in places here to move your software updates, right? And let's see. I can multi-select as well and do it. All right. So typically, you're going to allow the deployments. The typical way to run with this is to use software update groups and deploy the software update group as a whole. You can certainly deploy individual updates. In this case, you see that this update is deployed as part of my software update group. Right? Okay. So now I have the software update group. So this is nothing more than a container. You can go to properties, you can show members, right? But all this is a container, a group of software updates. You have the same options here to download, to deploy, to look at members or whatever, right? So I can see that I have just a few updates in this update group. Again, I can work with it, deploy, whatever the case may be. Notice the set security scope as well. So set security scope is definitely not software update specific. It's something that's ubiquitous in the console, but the idea of this goes along with the enhanced security in 2012. So in 2012, we have the ability to set a specific environment that users can see so that we control what their experience is, and we definitely can hone in a user's experience so they only see the objects they need and have the permissions that they need quite effectively. Setting security scopes, so think of it this way. If you set security scopes on a software update group, maybe there's a particular portion of your organization that cares about the Windows 7 updates, but they don't care about the Windows XP or the Server 2012 or the Server 2008 or whatever. Right? Or maybe you categorize it differently, right? And have the update groups named differently. Whatever makes sense, you can set security scopes on it. And then if they get into the console, then we will honor their security scope and only ever show them the security updates that are in their scope, right? But then, even more than that, reporting comes into play, right? So one of the deficits in RTM, we had the security scoping and really good control over being able to visualize what's out there. In RTM, reporting did not adhere to security scopes. So if you ran an all software updates report, then you would get every single update that's been configured regardless of your scope. Well, now with ConfigMgr, we do honor the security scope. So if you run that all software updates report, we're going to filter it and only show you those updates that you have the rights to see by security scopes. So setting something like this in security scopes could really help you in the way people view reports, right? So it only shows them the things that they care about. Okay. All right. So again, I've deployed through my software update group. You see my deployment here. Let's just walk through the wizard. Let's say that I had not. Let's go into my software update group, and I can go through and say deploy. Okay. So pretty standard stuff here. I'll just let it take the current name. I'm not going to save this. The software updates or software update group that I'm deploying is here. Okay. So then I have the ability to select a deployment template if I've got one that's previously saved. In this case, I don't have any, but if I did, I would have some, like from migration or whatever else. The collection that I'm going to deploy to, so I'll just pick one that is not effective for this. Then other things like the type of deployment, whether it's required, whether I want to use Wake on LAN. Notice the detail level. This is new in 2012. So in 2012, whenever you do a deployment, you're going to get a lot of information back in terms of state messages, such as, I'm downloading now, or I'm scanning now, or here's the state of it now, or whatever else, right? State messages are really small. In most environments, it's not that big a deal, but whenever you have a lot of clients, you can actually generate a lot of noise, even with small state messages. So you can choose, and it is by default, to only send up those success and error messages. All the rest of them will just stay on the client, not be sent forward, right? Or you can choose to do it all messages or only error or whatever makes sense. The default setting probably works for most environments. Okay. Next, we have scheduling, so client local time and different deadline options and so on. Pretty familiar stuff. The deadline behavior, whether we want to allow software update installation at the deadline, whether we want to allow system restarts at the deadline, even if we're not in a maintenance window, how we want to handle system restarts. Again, do we want to prevent restarts on workstation servers? What do we want to do? And then here's that option for write filters. So I told you that we will manage write filters for you in Service Pack 1 if we're deploying to embedded. That's true. And here's where you select it. Again, it's per deployment that you set this. And then next is our alerting page. So if you want to build alerts based on SLA or different things for this software update deployment, you can set it here. And then we go through download settings, secure summary, and different things, and we build the deployment. Well, I've already got one built, so I want to go ahead and leave. So here's my deployment that's already built. Right? So again, if I look at properties, arranges it a little bit differently, but essentially it's exactly the same. So deployment settings and scheduling and different things, right? But there is one other thing, and I don't think we saw it on the previous screen. Yeah, I don't think we got to it. Notice this. If software updates are not available on preferred distribution points or remote distribution points, download content from Microsoft Updates. This is a per deployment option. So this is what gives you the ability to go out to the internet and download content if something inside the ConfigMgr infrastructure doesn't have it already. And then this option, again, not on by default, allows you to pull the content from a cloud distribution point if you have one configured, if you want to do that. Okay. Again, there's some cost associated with it. It's not a free kind of thing, so we don't turn it on by default, but it's certainly there and workable for software updates if you want to use it. Okay. So good enough. Now, in terms of the deployment package, it's here, right? You can look at properties of it and have security scopes on it. Again, it's not largely different than what we had in 2007, but it does merit a bit of explanation. So what I'm about to describe existed in 2007, but there's a little bit of a twist in 2012. Let me explain. So typically, whenever you do a deployment, you think of deploying content along with the application or package or whatever else. So let me say it this way. Whenever you go build an application or go build a package, you're going to also deploy that to a distribution point. So there's a direct link between your application and package and the content that drives that application or package, right? In other words, you have to associate a distribution point with a given package, with a different given application to make sure the content that is being published by that package or application is available on the distribution point. Software updates are a bit different. So you can sit there and deploy software updates all day long. There is not a requirement to have a single package for a deployment. In other words, if you have 10 deployments, you don't have to have 10 packages. The deployments and the packages are not linked. The reason that's important is because you really don't need to manage more than the minimum number of deployment packages. Deployment packages are engineered such that they will store all of the content that you would need them to have for the environment. Certainly you have to have the software updates in a deployment package that's accessible in order to deploy them. Best way to illustrate this is a scenario. Say that you have Windows 7 patches that you're trying to deploy, and you need to create a separate deployment for, I don't know, the call center computers, a separate deployment for HR, a separate deployment for the executives, a separate deployment for the general population, whatever, right? But all of those deployments are going to feature some software updates in common. So if you were to have a requirement to have a separate deployment package for every single update deployment you did, then you would be duplicating a lot of content in your distribution points. Again, still thinking in terms of 2007, right? So what we did is we disassociated the deployment from the package. So now you do your deployment, the one for HR, the one for your call centers, the one for the general population, the one for your executives, just like you did before. But you put those updates in a single deployment package. The client then has this concept of figuring out which updates it actually needs, and will go to the distribution point and selectively download those updates from the package that is on the distribution point, from the content, I should say, that's on the distribution point, right? So there's really no need to have multiple packages. It would just, in 2007, if you did it that way, it would take up additional hard drive space on the distribution point unnecessarily, right? Well, again, that's nothing new. The way that works in 2012 is really the same as it was in 2007, except now we've also added the ability to store content uniquely on our distribution points. In the content library, we have the single instance store. So if there was a scenario where you had an update in common between deployment packages, now we optimize that for you even on the distribution point, because we only store it once in the content store, even if it is technically in more than one package, right? So a little bit of a tangent there to explain that, but I think it may be worth it to understand how this works. Okay? All right, so now we get to the what I think is one of the coolest things in 2012, the automated deployment rule. So, as mentioned earlier, the entire purpose of the automated deployment rule is to do what it says, to allow you to automate the deployment of software updates. Now, you can take this as far as you want it to. You can set up complete automation and let it drive for you the entire process, right? Or you can have some sort of hybrid, or you can continue to do it manually. Whatever makes sense and works best for your environment is fine. Now, I would expect that in most environments you're going to have multiple of these automated deployment rules. Let me explain what I mean. The best way to show you is to actually go through the process of creating one. So I'll just call this Windows 7 test. Okay? And here I have templates that I can choose to use. So I have the definition update template. That's for endpoint protection, right? I could choose to use that, put it in place. Notice that in this case, it's going to have certain default settings it puts on top of this wizard as we go through. But in this case, it's just a standard software update, so I'll use Patch Tuesday, and notice how it shifted to creating a new software update group every time this rule runs, right? Which makes sense, because whenever you work through Patch Tuesday, typically you're going to create a separate contained grouping of updates for that month, maintenance the others over to maybe a persistent package or a persistent deployment of updates for historical updates, that kind of thing, whatever. So it kind of follows that thought. Then you have the ability to enable the deployment after the rule is run. So basically, this is a choice to let you completely automate the deployment and just kind of be hands-off. It's kind of cool, but it kind of makes me nervous at the same time, right? At least until you get comfortable with the way automated deployment rules work, I would still want to check through and make sure that the deployment's set up the way I want and different things, right? This is also interesting. Notice this one. If I go back and use the endpoint protection one, it's just going to add updates to an existing software update group, which makes sense because it probably is the case in most environments that you have a single software update group for malware, for endpoint protection updates. Here's an interesting point associated with that. So when you deploy the updates in a given software update group, and then you go back later and add additional updates to that software update group, those new updates are deployed exactly the same way as the initial deployment was set up, right? So when you use the automated deployment rule to add deployments into an existing software update group, like you see here, once those updates go into the existing software update group, if there's an active deployment, they're going out to the environment, right? So that's something to know for sure. So we'll switch back to the Patch Tuesday group. Okay, and bear in mind, a lot of these settings that you're seeing go through here, these are settings that were in a template form in 2007. So really, in essence, with ADRs, really you are creating templates, right? And these templates, basically they're enforcing settings or overlaying settings, again, on this wizard. Okay. All right, so let's click next. So then the deployment settings again, I haven't gone through every single one of these to figure out what the various templates do, but again, we've seen all of these. Okay, what we want to do in terms of updates, do we want to automatically deploy all of them and automatically approve any license agreements, or do we want to do something differently? What updates do I want? So in this case, I said that I wanted Windows 7. So I'll clear this up here. So maybe I want Windows 7. Go find that. Windows 7. And maybe I want security update. So I'll leave that alone. So click next. So okay. So this raises an interesting discussion point. So this is the reason that you will very likely have multiple automatic deployment rules. Because at this screen, you filter which particular updates will be managed and handled by this particular automatic deployment rule, right? And here's the other thing. The automated deployment rule is forward-looking, right? It doesn't manage updates that are already downloaded into the database. It manages the process of fetching and configuring new ones, right? So you will have however many automated deployment rules make sense for the kinds of updates you're deploying. This leads me to another tangent that I've seen in several customer environments that are, again, worth discussing. So in several environments now that I've been to, several environments of size, I've seen customers who will basically pull down all of the updates that they need to deploy and send them to every machine in the environment. So in one case, I was at a customer that was 150,000 machines. And they were having issues with compliance reporting numbers being skewed and difficulty deploying updates to clients and WMI issues and different things. Well, what they were doing when they deploy everything to every machine, they had a mix. They had Server 2008, Server 2008 R2, Server 2003 still. They had Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows Vista, whatever. So every update in the environment would go to every one of those machines. They would have machines with Office, machines without it, with machines with whatever, the whole mix, right? And their theory behind doing that was actually sound, but it has some challenges. The theory was that if you take every update and deploy it to the client is only going to apply those updates that it needs. And that is correct. The client, if it's a Windows 7 client, will see a Windows XP update and discard it because it doesn't need it, right? Discard it meaning it won't run it. If it's a system that has Office on it, Office 2013, and it sees an Office 2007 patch, it's going to not run it because it doesn't need it. If it doesn't have Office, it's not going to run it because it doesn't need it. Here's the challenge with that. When you deploy to a larger subsection of systems than you need to, you're increasing the attack surface for things that could go wrong. Meaning, if you deploy to a collection, just to pick a number, of 10,000 machines, a particular patch, but really that patch only is applicable to 1,000 of those 10,000, then you're opening the possibility that if those other 9,000 machines have problems in reporting back, it can skew your numbers for success rate for that patch, right? So you want to be very selective about how you deploy these things and only push it to machines that you think actually will need it. And that's not just a software update discussion. That's a general discussion, right? Whether you're deploying task sequences, whether you're deploying packages, applications, whatever the case may be, you really only want to deploy them to systems that need them. Okay, there's another reason too. So when you deploy updates to the vast population and you know a good chunk of your environment is not going to need them, those systems that get those updates still have to process them, still have to scan for them, still have to report back that it doesn't need them. So there is traffic that takes place in the environment because of that. And then thirdly, all of these updates are stored in WMI. So references to them, the deployment of them, that kind of thing, stored in WMI. So you increase the size potentially of WMI, and it just it's not a good thing. I've seen some instances where WMI repository would get to a large size and then WMI would have problems. So again, avoiding deploying things to systems that you know don't need those things is a really good idea. So what that will oftentimes end up meaning is you will have multiple deployment rules to handle things. So you might have a Windows 7 deployment rule. You might have a Windows Vista deployment rule, a Windows Server 2008 deployment rule, an Office deployment rule, whatever makes sense for you, right? And this is where you do it. All right, so we go next, and we can decide how we want to handle synchronization. Right now, there is no synchronization set up. You saw that earlier. How often we want to run this rule. So this is a Patch Tuesday rule. So you see by default we're running it once a month. Doesn't really make sense to run it more often, though you can. Right? Custom schedules possible too. Deployment schedule. This is where we decide client local time, our deadline schedule, how soon it goes in, that kind of thing. User experience. Okay. Again, we've seen all this before. Whether we want to display the update notifications, whatever. Alerting. Again, all of these are screens that we've already seen. We're just setting them up now in an automated deployment rule. So I'm going to cancel it because you get the idea. And that was misspelled. I'd forgotten that was misspelled, but either way. So if I go back into it, you see the same settings, just aligned a little bit differently. Okay. So that's it for automated deployment rules. Okay, pretty cool thing. Definitely test it in your environment before you try to do real fancy things, and especially before you let it go on its own, right? But some pretty interesting possibilities to automate activities that typically are manual now. So one other thing that I want to show you just quickly, and that's really all I'm going to do is just briefly touch it, is the monitoring node. So I mentioned that there's a couple of places that monitoring is different in 2012. The UI designed different things, right? 3 places. First of all, the alerts. So on the alerts node is where all of the alerts get surfaced up. Okay, so you can look at an alert, look at the active alerts, whatever. You can create subscriptions to an alert. Again, decide whether you're going to email yourself based on getting a given alert, whatever the case may be. All right. There's another section where we look at the software update point synchronization status. It'll tell us, how we're doing. Are we good to go? Okay, and different things. And then finally, for our deployments, and this is any kind of deployment, you see task sequence, you'll see software updates and different things. You'll be able to see the results. So this has gone out to nobody, which means I don't have any results. But still, these areas of the console plus reporting will be very interesting to you as you look at software updates. All right. So that's really all for this session. And again, this is the start of a series of discussions on the software updates in ConfigMgr 2012, how they work and different things. So this kind of helps set the stage, at least do a little bit of an overview, introduction to the concept, and we'll continue to dig in on future sessions. So we'll see you next time.